Hello, and welcome to Journey with Monarchs Storytime with Victoria Beeler. Today, we will be reading Part 3 in Jo Brewer's Wings in the Meadow. In Part 2, we read chapters 8 through 13. Today, we will be starting on Chapter 14. Chapter 14, Another End, Another Beginning. October 19th to November 23rd. Happiness is the shadow of things past, which fools still take for that which is to be, and not all foolishly, for all the past read true is prophecy, and all the first are hauntings of some last, and all the springs are flashlights of one spring. Francis Thompson. Between September 6th and October 6th, there were in all about 12,000 monarchs which passed through Eastern Point. But further south during the same time, 240,000 passed through a gap in the Appalachian Mountains. Flying by other routes from other places, there were countless thousands more, which were seen flying only briefly as they passed overhead, or which were seen feeding in small groups in inland marshes and meadows. Some were never seen at all, but would cross the plains numbering in the hundreds of thousands and pass the winter months in some hidden spot still kept a secret from all mankind. But by the 10th of October, there were only stragglers, the weakest, the smallest, the last of all the emergents, whose wings were perhaps not wholly sound. The marsh in all of New England was as if the monarchs had never been there. The asters and the goldenrod had begun to tarnish. The royal procession, the shower of gold, was a thing of the past, and no more was left in its wake to mark its passing than is left by the memory of a dream. The children of Danaus and his whole new tribe flew along the beaches of New England and crossed small bodies of water with the wind. When they reached the Cape Cod Canal, they flew along its banks and continued south on the east shore of Buzzard's Bay to Woods Hole. From there, they crossed to Martha's Vineyard, where they congregated at Gay Head. From Gay Head, they traveled over 60 miles across open water to Montauk Point, stopping only briefly to rest at Block Island. They congregated again at West Hampton, 60 miles further along the south shore of Long Island. The following night, they swarmed in trees at Long Beach, and early the next morning crossed the mouth of New York Harbor. Their group was not always the same, for some diverged to other routes and found other monarchs along the way, and it was never possible to know where the monarchs along the endless stretches of sand and in the nearby countryside had begun their journey. From a place near Red Bank on the south side of New York Harbor, they continued on down the coast to Cape May, New Jersey, where they waited 3 days for a favorable wind. Each day, more monarchs joined them, and by the time they reached Ocean City, Maryland, over 40,000 butterflies were swarming together in the trees. Here they encountered a heavy wind, which forced some of them inland to Crisfield, and these followed the Delmar Peninsula, which forms the east side of Chesapeake Bay, while the rest followed the other shore of the same peninsula, so that all were again reunited at Virginia Beach. Again at Virginia Beach, strong winds assailed them, and many were swept inland across the dismal swamp as far as Winton, on the Chowan River, which empties into Albemarle Sound in North Carolina. These flew down to Plymouth and across to Swan Quarter, and other monarchs joined them on the way. The remainder of the group flew to Kitty Hawk, and then they too reached Swan Quarter. Here, for no apparent reason, they stopped. Each day, for 4 days more, butterflies arrived until at the end of the 4th day, there were more than 10,000 monarchs weighing down the branches of the trees. On the morning of the 5th day, the sky was murky, and long clouds distorted by wind were tumbling across the sky. After the clouds came a storm with gale winds and driving rains which lasted for a day and a night. But before dawn of the 2nd day, the rain slackened as the clouds were blown out to sea. It was only after this, under a blue and docile sky, that the monarchs took to the air once more in a long, thin procession. Somehow they had been aware of the approaching storm, and rather than risk being caught in the air in the midst of it, had waited for it to pass, protected by each other in the branches of the trees. From Swan Quarter to the Croton National Forest, to the Orton Plantation and Carolina Beach, still in North Carolina, and still following the coastline, they came to Sullivan Island in South Carolina. South, south, ever south, until the huge mass of butterflies came to Sea Island, Georgia. It was the 19th of October. About this same time, near Swan Island in the Caribbean Sea, there was a disturbance in the upper atmosphere, a little cold stream of air which began to mingle with the shimmering heat that had been rising from the surface of the water as the result of a week-long Indian summer. As the swarm of monarchs approached Sea Island, Georgia, there were more than 200,000 individuals following the same route. The first arrived on October 19th, and these pressed onward as more and more butterflies arrived, flying as high as 150 feet in the air in a steady stream which flowed without cease from 7 o'clock in the morning to 4 in the afternoon for 3 days. The swarm separated at Sea Island, some continuing south in the direction of Lake Okeechobee, which is at the northern border of the Everglades. The others turned west toward Lighthouse Point, which is on the Gulf Coast of Florida, south of Tallahassee. But on the 22nd of October, the migration came to a standstill. All that day and the next, more monarchs poured into Sea Island, but none departed. Also, on the 22nd, those which had pressed south toward Lake Okeechobee, perhaps 75,000, came to a halt and huddled together in a huge drift on a live oak tree at Titusville Beach, about 50 miles south of Daytona. The distance from Sea Island to Lighthouse Point could have been covered by the flock in 4 days with ease. From Titusville Beach to the Everglades was about the same distance, and yet these two agglomerations of butterflies would not move to complete the last lap of their journey. The weather was warm and clear with light northerly winds. It seemed a perfect day for flying, but somehow the butterflies knew as they had known before. They knew what the Weather Bureau also knew, and what the people knew because they had been warned of it in the newspapers, that the little disturbance in the Caribbean Sea had begun slowly to gather, that winds and pressures and temperatures were giving it shape. It was performing a slow pirouette and at the same time starting to move in the direction of the channel which runs between the Yucatan Peninsula and Cuba, leading into the Gulf of Mexico. The wind had begun like a sigh, which no one noticed, but gradually it rose to a groan, a whining groan still far away, but so continuous a sound that finally it was heard, and it stirred uneasiness and dread in those who had heard it before. This was on the 21st of October. During the night, the wind gathered force, and on the morning of October 22nd, a gray pall hung over the horizon. The leaden surface of the Gulf shivered and vacillated as though the timeless rhythms of its tides had lost their certainty. By noon, the dread sound had risen to a roar as the storm wheeled into the Gulf of Mexico, with the wind blowing at 70 miles an hour. At 1:30, it had blacked out the light of the sun, and flashes of blue and purple light coming from within the tortuous mask of clouds spread an eerie incandescence across the darkness of the southern sky. All day long, seabirds and shorebirds could be seen spreading away from the storm's path, seeking in desperation some inland haven, some sheltered cove in which they might be saved from the devastating wrath of the wind. As the hurricane entered the Gulf, it shifted its course, and late that afternoon, its full force struck the west coast of Florida all the way from Sarasota to Inverness with a savage fury. The rain, which had fallen at first in stinging needles, now drove down upon land and sea alike in a black sheet. The waves were plowed into geysers, turned into columns of fluid stone, which thundered against each other in the shore in a ceaseless, terrible cannonade. The wind at its peak knew no restraint, but shrieked and screamed and tore at the land like a living creature bereft of all reason, yet possessed of strength beyond all reason. It bent the palm trees double beneath its lash, flung them to the ground, ripped out their fruit, and sent it hurtling through the air to smash walls, windows, vehicles already crippled by the flooding streets. The few boats remaining in Tampa Bay were wrenched from their moorings and battered into splinters against half-submerged buildings and piers, or cast ashore where they were crushed together like walnuts. And above this screeching insanity, time after time, came the sickening shudder of roofs being twisted and tortured and sent crashing against the nearest object left standing, of glass being violently broken, the terrifying sound of human voices trying to be heard as people trapped by the engulfing tides clung frantically to jagged pieces of floating wreckage which they shared with drowning animals. The unfortunate birds which had been caught in the center of the storm were sucked into the air and imprisoned by walls of gyrating wind as the hurricane raged across the peninsula of Florida, leaving disaster and desolation in its wake. It wreaked destruction upon the land for 15 hours before it reached the east coast and started out to sea once more. And by the time it reached the sea, its viciousness had begun to slacken. Sea Island, Georgia, 75 miles to the north, was out of reach of the claws of the hurricane and felt only the malevolence of its breath, which fanned the sea into cauldrons of foam and streamed through the trees so that they shook and jostled like mute bells. The Monarchs clung together in tight sheaves. The innermost were sheltered by harm by those on the outside, as leaves at the bottom of the heap are protected while those on the outside blow gradually away. The southernmost edge of the hurricane struck Titusville Beach, and although its worst fury was spent, the winds were still so ferocious and the rain so cruel that the Monarchs, however dense and solid the cluster they had formed, however sturdy the tree in which they were huddled, could not prevail against it. Thousands were dashed to the ground, and thousands more thrust into the sea to be regurgitated later on the beach in a long, pathetic ribbon. The rest were propelled upward into the dizzying maelstrom as the hurricane surged out to sea. Some struggled to escape from the turbulence of the storm, and these were quickly torn apart. Some lowered their wings and drew their legs tightly against their bodies, and a very few of these, were drawn into the eye of the hurricane and so might have been able to survive. About 300 miles out at sea, there was a tramp steamer sailing northeast from the Bahamas, bound for Bermuda in England and carrying a cargo of rum and cotton. The hurricane, gasping out its fierce life in 50-mile-an-hour gusts, bore down upon it, whipping the sea into towering waves. All day long the ship lurched blindly on through the pelting rain, while a raw white top spun across its decks and broke against its iron hull with a voice like crashing glass. Most of the live creatures which had been caught up by the onrushing storm had either escaped or lost their lives in an attempt to escape. But a few warblers, a small tern, and perhaps 500 or 600 monarch butterflies were still prisoners in the whirling mass. In the dark of the night, the dimming eye of the storm crossed the path of the freighter, blew against it from the opposite direction. Gradually, the storm and its aftermath subsided. Somewhere in the broad expanse of the ocean it dissipated, and the sun rose one morning on a sea of glittering blue and great rolling billows upon which the freighter rose and fell, its deck strewn with butterflies. Many of them seemed to be dead, or nearly so, for they were unable to move. The astonished crew saved some for souvenirs and swept the rest into the sea, but here and there on the ship a very few, escaped unseen, and they clung precariously to whatever foothold they could find. Had the others really been dead, or warmed by the noonday sun, would they have rallied and tried to find land once more? No one would ever know, for on shipboard there is no time and no room for such an observation. The butterflies had descended upon the ship some time during the early evening of the night before, but where they had come from was a mystery. Since monarchs can fly only 80 miles in a day, and since they habitually roost for the night even before the sun has set, they could not have flown 300 miles over open water and arrived on the freighter's deck of their own volition. They must have rather been blown out over the sea by a strong prevailing wind. But where had the wind come from? And where had the swarm been captured by the wind? Had a westerly gale scooped them from a seaside meadow somewhere along the southern coast? Or had they been waiting and testing the wind on some desolate strip of land, some outer beach separated from the mainland? Had they become disoriented when the wind blew from an unfamiliar quarter and allowed themselves to be carried out across the ocean? Or was it possible that when the hurricane had died, the butterflies trapped within it, the last living monarchs of the 75,000 or more which had been at Titusville, had somehow found strength to fly back toward land, even in the hours of semi-darkness, and in doing so upon the ship once more? Such conjectures have no more logic in them than does the hurricane which alters its course, the tide which ebbs and flows twice in an afternoon, the tree which stands when all the others are torn out by their roots, the swarm of lost butterflies which descends exhausted on the pinpoint refuge of a ship at sea. The above episode is based upon an incident which occurred aboard the USS Joseph T. Dickman, a Coast Guard vessel used for troop transport during World War II. The incident was reported to me by a friend who was a pharmacist's mate aboard the ship at the time. The Dickman was en route from Boston to Cape Town. During the war, the exact routes of such vessels was not generally known, and the crew did not know the location of the ship at any given time. The USS Dickman was somewhere in a neutral zone following a generally southern course when butterflies descended upon it in such numbers that the decks were literally covered with them. The crew members who saw them alight reported a swarm of butterflies. Next day, the insects, although not dead, were too feeble to move, and had to be swept away when it became evident that those who had been crushed underfoot were causing the deck to become slippery. A shellback certificate shows that on this voyage, the USS Dickman crossed the equator on November 24th, 1941 at 40 degrees 27 west longitude. The invasion by butterflies had reportedly taken place before that time. Early the following month, 2 monarch butterflies were sighted in England, and a third battered specimen was caught by an amateur entomologist and sent to the British Museum, where it remains. The monarchs which rode out the storm at Sea Island, Georgia, were tattered and torn, but most of them survived. When the sun had finally dried them, they continued undaunted and eventually completed the long, long voyage. Some crossed the Okefenokee Swamp and, traveling southwest, began to arrive in Lighthouse Point the 1st of November. The others flew down the battered coast and in a week had found a roosting site in the Everglades. Early in the afternoon of the day before Thanksgiving, Mr. Stevens started out to spend one last weekend at his cabin before closing it for the winter. It was a perfect November day, cold enough to make his fingers tingle and his breath whisk away in smoky puffs. The trees had long since lost their leaves and stood along the edges of the meadow like gray skeletons, friendly skeletons standing guard while the meadow slept. Mr. Stevens made a fire in his fireplace, lit his stove, and started coffee before unpacking the Jeep. There was much to be done. The windows and doors must be boarded up, and the larder made mouse-proof. The annual tree must be felled across the path. Naturally, last year's log could not be used again because it served as roof for the fox's den, and the foxes must still be in it because just outside the entrance there was a little pile of bones which looked like the bones of a squirrel. Then there was the last walk through the meadow, preferably early the next morning when there might be frost underfoot. He liked to walk over the dried grass after a frost when everything was covered with thin crystals of ice that crunched beneath his feet. It sounded like something delicious being chewed, like very thin sugar cookies with cinnamon on them. Then he would cook a steak for his Thanksgiving dinner. By Sunday afternoon, everything would be in order, and last of all, he would padlock and bar the door. The next morning, little crystals of hoarfrost had spread in a thin crust over the meadow floor, and the grass crunched under his feet. He walked the boundaries of his land, noticing all those things which were so well hidden when the field was lush and green. The great holes of the woodchucks, the grassy nest of the redwing, the piles of rotting apples under the wild crabapple trees, and the gray pouch which the oriole had woven without his ever having noticed it was there. Ragna would like to have that for her nest collection, he thought. What a child! She would love the meadow. Why had he never brought her here, he wondered. He stood looking out over the part of the world that no one but he himself enjoyed, and he thought how different it would look if Ragna were out there plunging through the grass. It came to him with a sudden shock that he had been living in the past, that he had been trying to make the meadow into a mausoleum for his memories by keeping it all to himself, by hiding in it. He had turned his back on the present with all its bubbling laughter, and it had been right there waiting for him all along, pulling him by the hand. What a waste! But next year, when vacation came, next year she would come. And it wasn't just Ragna either. There must be dozens of children. He would talk to the conservation people tomorrow. They might want the meadow, small as it was. And then all the children who wanted to would be able to come and explore. Otherwise, Ragna should have it, and perhaps someday her children would catch little green snakes here and see wings of flame rising to the sun. At last, everything was done. He took one last look around him and closed the door for the last time. As he drove away, he noticed that the meadow was a soft, universal brown, more tan than brown. The grass shone like the soft hair of little children, and the dried flowers, the ghosts of summer, stood stark and stiff, the goldenrod foaming with little silken tassels, the Queen Anne's lace lifting its brown calluses, the rest hardly more than stiff brown spears. In the pods of the milkweed, the silk had lain in long, damp threads, and the seeds had been packed tightly, one overlapping the other like scales. Then the pods had cracked, and in almost the same way that Danaus had emerged from his chrysalis and unfolded his wings to the world, the milkweed silk had dried and expanded and flown from the pods to scatter its seeds over the meadow. Now the stalks were dry and leafless, with only the twisted remnants of their pods to show which flower they once had been. And that is the story of Wings in the Meadow. Thank you so much and have a blessed day.